War has a way of exposing illusions faster than peace ever can. And one of Germany's greatest illusions by 1944 was the belief that engineering brilliance could still compensate for strategic exhaustion. The Panther symbolized that illusion perfectly. Every technical evaluation after the war confirmed its strengths: superior frontal armor, exceptional long-range firepower, advanced optics, deadly battlefield performance when conditions favored it. Historians still debate which tank was technically the finest of the Second World War. The Panther always enters the conversation. But history rarely rewards technical perfection by itself. Because war is not a laboratory. A machine can dominate isolated engagements and still lose the larger conflict surrounding it. That contradiction haunted Germany during the final years of the war. At Arracourt, Panthers often destroyed American tanks efficiently when direct engagements occurred under favorable conditions. Some German crews fought with extraordinary discipline despite worsening circumstances. Yet every tactical success seemed unable to change the overall direction of the battle. That is what systemic defeat looks like. You continue winning local moments while losing operational reality. And operational reality inside Lorraine had already shifted toward the Americans long before many German commanders fully recognized it. The battlefield itself no longer favored concentration. Earlier in the war, Germany excelled at concentrating force faster than enemies could respond. Blitzkrieg depended on creating overwhelming local superiority at decisive points. Fast armored breakthroughs disrupted enemy coordination before defenses stabilized. But at Arracourt, concentration became dangerous. Large armored movements attracted artillery. Road congestion attracted aircraft. Predictable attack corridors attracted ambushes. Every attempt to mass force created larger targets for the American system to process and destroy.
This forced German commanders into an impossible dilemma: disperse, and offensive momentum weakened; concentrate, and the battlefield punished them immediately. Meanwhile, the Americans benefited from defense in depth combined with mobility. Instead of relying on rigid, static lines, they continuously repositioned according to pressure points. Hellcats shifted locations after every engagement. Sherman units blocked key routes temporarily before relocating again. Artillery coverage adapted constantly through radio coordination. The battlefield became fluid. And fluid battlefields favor faster systems over stronger machines. That principle extends far beyond war. Empires fail when they become too rigid to adapt. Corporations collapse when systems slow beneath changing conditions. Even civilizations decay when institutions prioritize preserving structure over evolving function. Germany entered Arracourt with extraordinary weapons attached to an increasingly inflexible strategic reality. America entered Arracourt with imperfect weapons attached to a rapidly evolving operational system. The outcome became almost inevitable. Still, inevitability does not reduce the brutality of what happened there. Inside burning Panthers, crews died in seconds. Ammunition detonated violently enough to tear turrets apart. Fuel ignited across cramped interiors while radio operators desperately attempted final transmissions through smoke and fire. American crews suffered no gentler fate. The Hellcats' thin armor turned direct hits into massacres. Sherman tanks often erupted into towering columns of black smoke visible across miles of countryside. Men escaped burning vehicles only to face artillery fragments or machine gun fire moments later. Arracourt was not a clean triumph. It was a mechanized slaughter disguised as operational brilliance. And that is important to remember, because systems do not remove human suffering. They simply organize it more efficiently. That cold truth became visible everywhere across the battlefield. Crews fought inside machines they already knew were vulnerable. Many American tankers understood perfectly well that Panthers outclassed them in direct combat. Yet they continued operating aggressively because doctrine no longer demanded winning direct combat consistently.
It demanded enabling the system. That mindset changed battlefield psychology completely. A German Panther crew often thought in terms of individual dominance: superior armor, superior range, superior gun. An American crew increasingly thought in terms of contribution: delay the enemy, reveal enemy movement, hold attention, create targeting opportunities for artillery or aircraft. The difference sounds subtle. In reality, it transformed the nature of mechanized warfare. One philosophy centered around the supremacy of the individual weapon. The other centered around interdependence. And interdependent systems become frighteningly difficult to destroy once fully matured. By late September, the German counteroffensive in Lorraine had effectively failed. The surviving Panthers withdrew eastward. American forces regained momentum. And somewhere beneath the smoke drifting across Arracourt, a deeper realization settled quietly into military history. The age of isolated battlefield superiority was ending. The future belonged to integration.
After the war, military historians spent decades arguing about tanks, armor thickness, endless comparisons between Panthers, Tigers, Shermans, T-34s, Pershings. But Arracourt quietly exposed a truth that made many of those debates strangely incomplete. The battlefield had already moved beyond the tank itself. That is why Arracourt became deeply important inside American military education after the war. Not because it was the largest armored battle, not because American tanks suddenly proved superior, but because the battle demonstrated with brutal clarity that tactical systems could overpower technical superiority. And the implications stretched far beyond Lorraine. The United States Army studied Arracourt for decades because the principles visible there kept repeating across modern warfare. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, even modern drone warfare today. The same pattern appears again and again. The side capable of integrating information, mobility, communication, and rapid adaptation usually defeats opponents relying primarily on individual battlefield strength. Technology still matters, of course, but isolated technology matters less than synchronized technology. That distinction shaped the post-war world. Germany built magnificent armored vehicles during the Second World War. Yet by the late stages of the conflict, German industry increasingly struggled to produce enough fuel, spare parts, experienced crews, and coordinated support infrastructure to sustain those vehicles effectively. America approached the problem differently.
Instead of creating the single most dominant machine possible, the United States increasingly optimized production, logistics, replacement capability, communication systems, and combined arms coordination. One philosophy pursued battlefield excellence. The other pursued battlefield continuity. And continuity eventually consumed excellence through sheer operational endurance. This was not glamorous. That is why many people misunderstand it. A single Tiger tank destroying multiple enemy vehicles creates legendary stories, burning columns, heroic last stands, dramatic battlefield imagery. Radio coordination between artillery observers and fighter aircraft does not look cinematic. But one changes battles. The other changes wars. At Arracourt, the Americans no longer required perfect conditions to remain effective. That mattered enormously. Their battlefield organism adapted continuously despite weather changes, communication breakdowns, unit losses, and fragmented visibility. The Germans increasingly depended on conditions remaining favorable. Clear firing lanes, coordinated armored thrusts, reliable logistics, predictable command flow. Once those conditions deteriorated, the Panther's terrifying battlefield potential became harder and harder to convert into operational success. That reality produced enormous frustration among German crews. Many knew their tanks were technically superior. They could feel it during direct engagements. They saw American shells fail against frontal armor. They watched Panthers destroy Shermans at ranges where return fire became difficult. And yet, they still kept losing ground. That contradiction damaged morale in ways statistics rarely capture. Because soldiers can endure disadvantage if they understand the reason. What destroys confidence is superiority without victory. That is exactly what Arracourt created. A battlefield where Germany often possessed the stronger machine, but America controlled the stronger process. And process eventually governs outcome.
There is a deeper philosophical lesson hidden inside that idea. Human beings naturally admire visible power, large armies, massive weapons, impressive technology. But history repeatedly shows that invisible systems often matter far more than visible strength. Rome conquered through roads, logistics, and administration as much as legions. Britain controlled oceans through naval systems and global supply networks, not merely ships. Modern economies dominate through infrastructure, information flow, and organizational adaptability more than raw resources alone. At Arracourt, those same principles appeared inside mechanized warfare. The Americans built a battlefield where every element reinforced every other element. Hellcats created flanking pressure. Shermans fixed enemy attention. Artillery controlled movement corridors. Aircraft punished exposed maneuver. Radio synchronized the entire structure. No individual component needed perfection. The perfection existed in the interaction itself. Germany never fully solved that problem because German doctrine evolved during an earlier stage of warfare, a stage where operational brilliance and superior armored concentration could still overwhelm slower opponents before systems fully reacted. By 1944, Allied industrial coordination and communication speed had changed the battlefield permanently. The war Germany prepared for no longer existed. And yet Germany kept fighting it anyway. That is one of history's cruelest traps. Success often teaches institutions the wrong lesson.
Early German victories reinforced faith in aggressive armored excellence.
The final collapse of the German offensive at Arracourt did not happen in one dramatic moment. There was no single explosion, no iconic surrender scene, no famous photograph that captured the exact second victory shifted permanently toward the Americans. Instead, the collapse happened the way modern systems usually collapse. Gradually. Then, suddenly. At first, German commanders still believed success remained possible. Individual Panthers continued scoring kills. Some American units temporarily withdrew under pressure. Certain roads changed hands multiple times within hours. From the outside, the battle still looked contested. But underneath the surface, the operational mathematics had already turned against Germany. Fuel consumption increased faster than resupply. Vehicle losses accumulated faster than replacements could arrive. Crew exhaustion intensified. Communication slowed. Coordination weakened. And every hour allowed the American system to reinforce itself further. This is one of the least glamorous truths in warfare. Momentum is expensive, especially for the attacker. Every kilometer forward demands fuel, ammunition, communication, reconnaissance, and synchronization. Offensive warfare burns resources at terrifying speed. Once offensive tempo slows, the attacking force becomes exposed during the exact moment it needs flexibility most. That was the trap closing around the German Panzer brigades. At Arracourt, the Americans did not simply defend territory. They defended time.
Every delayed German movement benefited Allied logistics. Every stalled armored thrust gave artillery observers more opportunities to prepare firing zones. Every destroyed fuel truck weakened future German mobility even further. The battlefield slowly transformed into an equation Germany could no longer sustain. Meanwhile, American commanders increasingly sensed the shift. Creighton Abrams understood it instinctively. So did many junior officers across the 4th Armored Division. The Germans were still dangerous, but they were no longer controlling events. That distinction changed American behavior dramatically. Units began operating with greater confidence. Defensive reactions evolved into aggressive maneuvering. Tank crews who spent earlier days surviving ambushes now repositioned proactively to intercept retreat routes and vulnerable German movement corridors. The Americans could feel the enemy losing initiative. And once initiative collapses in mechanized warfare, fear spreads quickly through command structures. German crews increasingly faced impossible uncertainty. Advance and risk artillery and aircraft. Pause and lose momentum. Withdraw and expose vulnerable rear movement. Hold position and risk encirclement. The battlefield offered no stable solution anymore. That psychological pressure mattered enormously. Because modern warfare is not only industrial, it is cognitive. A crew trapped inside a Panther under constant uncertainty begins making slower decisions. Officers receiving fragmented reports lose confidence in battlefield awareness. Coordination weakens because nobody fully trusts the information arriving through damaged communication networks at Arracourt. At Arracourt, the American system attacked not only German vehicles, it attacked German decision-making itself. And eventually, the pressure became unsustainable.
By September 22nd, organized German offensive capability across the sector had largely disintegrated. Surviving Panthers withdrew eastward in fragmented groups. Damaged vehicles littered roadsides and fields across Lorraine. Some crews abandoned tanks entirely after fuel shortages made continued maneuver impossible. The offensive was over. But the implications were only beginning. Because Arracourt proved something profoundly unsettling for military thinkers around the world. A technologically superior platform could be systematically neutralized by a faster, more adaptive operational network. That lesson extended far beyond tanks. And future wars would confirm it repeatedly. Radar networks would change air combat. Aircraft carriers would replace battleships. Missile systems would challenge traditional armored doctrines. Digital communication would transform battlefield coordination again and again. Each time, the same principle reappeared. Integration defeats isolation. The Panther simply became one of history's most famous examples of a magnificent isolated weapon trapped inside an increasingly obsolete operational framework. And perhaps that is why Arracourt still feels strangely modern even today. because the battle was never really about tanks. It was about adaptation. About whether institutions evolve faster than reality changes around them. Germany failed that test. America passed it.
3 months after Arracourt, the war delivered its final test, the Ardennes, December 1944. Snow covered the forests of Belgium, while exhausted Allied forces believed Germany no longer possessed the strength for a major offensive. Many American units rested behind quiet sectors. Supply routes stretched through frozen roads. Winter clouds grounded aircraft across much of the front. Then, Germany struck. The Battle of the Bulge began with overwhelming surprise. Massive artillery barrages shattered the silence before dawn. German armored columns surged westward through the Ardennes forests, attempting one final gamble to split Allied armies apart and force a negotiated peace. For a brief moment, it almost worked. American lines fractured. Communications collapsed in several sectors. Retreating vehicles clogged icy roads while German Panthers and assault guns advanced through snow-covered valleys. To many observers, it looked like the return of classic German armored warfare. Fast breakthroughs, shock, momentum, panic. The exact style of war that had once conquered Europe. But hidden beneath the chaos was something Germany failed to understand. The American system that survived Arracourt still existed. And systems do not disappear because conditions worsen. In fact, mature systems often become even more valuable under pressure. At Bastogne, one of the most famous defensive battles of the entire war, the same principles visible at Arracourt appeared again under completely different conditions. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division defended the town alongside armored units from the 10th Armored Division and M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Different terrain, different weather, different enemy offensive. Same operational architecture. The Germans attempted to isolate Bastogne through armored encirclement. Roads became the center of the battle because whoever controlled movement controlled reinforcement, resupply, and maneuver. And once again, the Americans responded through integration rather than individual superiority. Hellcats repositioned rapidly between defensive sectors. Sherman tanks delayed armored thrusts long enough for artillery coordination. Infantry secured urban strongpoints. Radio communication linked fragmented units into a functioning defensive organism despite encirclement. No single component could have held Bastogne alone. That was the critical lesson. Not the tanks, not the paratroopers, not the artillery. Together, however, they multiplied each other's effectiveness far beyond what isolated units could achieve independently. One American commander later described it perfectly. The ensemble tripled the fighting power of every individual element. That sentence quietly explains modern warfare better than almost any technical manual ever written. Power no longer existed primarily inside the platform. Power existed inside the connection between platforms. And once that principle matured, Germany's strategic position became hopeless. Because Germany still excelled at building exceptional weapons.
But America excelled at building exceptional operational ecosystems around ordinary weapons. That distinction determined the final outcome of the war. By 1945, German engineering continued producing frightening machines. The King Tiger, advanced anti-tank weapons, early jet aircraft, experimental designs decades ahead of their time. Yet none of it solved the fundamental problem. Germany could still innovate tactically. It could no longer sustain operationally. The Americans and Soviets, meanwhile, continued generating overwhelming battlefield continuity through logistics, communication, manpower replacement, and industrial integration. The war became less about isolated moments of brilliance, more about which civilization could maintain coordinated pressure longer. Germany lost that contest permanently sometime after Normandy. Arracourt simply revealed it clearly. And perhaps that is why the battle matters far beyond military history. Because Arracourt exposes a pattern visible everywhere human systems compete. People often worship visible excellence while ignoring invisible infrastructure. They admire the powerful individual while overlooking the network supporting him. They study the machine while forgetting the supply chain, communication flow, decision structure, and adaptability surrounding it. But over time, invisible systems usually decide visible outcomes. A brilliant company fails because its organization becomes rigid. A talented athlete declines because recovery systems collapse. An empire weakens because administration decays beneath military prestige.
And armies lose because they keep optimizing the wrong battlefield. That was Germany's tragedy. The Panther answered the question of how to dominate a tank battle. America answered the question of how to make tank battles strategically irrelevant. Those are not the same thing. And history rarely rewards the side answering yesterday's question better than everyone else.
After the war ended, German officers studied Arracourt carefully, not because they doubted the Panther's battlefield power, because they needed to understand why powerful armored formations kept failing against American forces despite possessing superior machines. The conclusions they reached were deeply uncomfortable. German post-war analysis repeatedly identified two catastrophic weaknesses during the Lorraine offensive. First, reconnaissance failure. Second, incomplete integration. The Panzer Brigades attacking Arracourt entered battle with dangerously poor awareness of American defensive structure. They knew enemy tanks existed, they knew approximate positions, but they did not understand how deeply connected the American response system had become. And without reconnaissance, modern warfare becomes blindness disguised as aggression. German armored formations advanced into terrain already woven together by artillery registration zones, air-ground communication networks, and mobile anti-tank doctrine refined through nearly 2 years of continuous combat adaptation. They were not entering a battlefield. They were entering an operational web. The second problem proved even more fatal. The German brigade simply lacked the combined arms maturity necessary for sustained offensive operations against a modern integrated defense. Earlier in the war, elite panzer formations functioned as highly coordinated organisms. Tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, reconnaissance, logistics, and communications evolved together through repeated campaigns. By Arracourt, many new German formations no longer possessed that cohesion. Crews received advanced Panthers without enough training time. Supporting infantry remained insufficient or poorly synchronized. Reconnaissance elements lacked strength. Logistical infrastructure weakened under constant Allied pressure.
The result was tragic. Germany built world-class armored predators and then deployed them inside increasingly fragile operational ecosystems. That mismatch became impossible to hide at Arracourt. Meanwhile, the Americans evolved in the opposite direction. The Sherman tank itself was rarely the strongest machine on the battlefield. Many American crews admitted this openly after the war. Panthers and Tigers often possessed superior armor and firepower during direct engagements. But the Sherman integrated beautifully into the larger American system. It was reliable, easy to repair, available in enormous numbers, compatible with evolving logistics and communication networks. The Americans optimized not for battlefield perfection, but for battlefield continuity. That philosophy frustrated many observers after the war because it lacked romantic drama. People naturally admire exceptional objects. A Tiger tank looks legendary. A functioning logistics structure does not. Yet one changes tactical moments, the other changes history. Military historian Stephen Zaloga later summarized the Panther's situation with painful clarity. The Panther was technically superior, but technical superiority increasingly mattered less against mature Allied combined arms warfare.
That sentence quietly explains the entire collapse of Germany's armored advantage in Western Europe. Because by late 1944, the battlefield itself had evolved faster than German doctrine. The Americans no longer needed to defeat Panthers through isolated tank duels consistently. They only needed to prevent Panthers from operating under favorable conditions long enough for the larger system to consume them. Artillery disrupted movement. Aircraft punished exposure. Hellcats attacked vulnerable angles. Shermans fixed attention. Radio networks accelerated coordination. Every element reduced the Panther's ability to fight the war it was designed for. And once that happened, even extraordinary engineering could not fully compensate. This is why Arracourt still appears in military academies decades later. Not because it proved American tanks were superior. It proved that systems thinking eventually overwhelms isolated battlefield excellence. That principle now defines nearly all modern conflict. Cyber warfare, satellite networks, drone coordination, electronic warfare, real-time battlefield data integration. Modern militaries increasingly fight as interconnected ecosystems rather than collections of individual weapons. In many ways, Arracourt was an early glimpse of that future. A battlefield where information flow and reaction speed mattered more than armor thickness alone. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Germany actually understood systems better than almost anyone during the early years of the war. Blitzkrieg itself depended on operational integration, fast communications, air-ground coordination, mechanized tempo. But early success created intellectual rigidity. Germany became trapped by the methods that once made it unstoppable. America, meanwhile, evolved through failure. Kasserine Pass humiliated the United States Army. Normandy forced adaptation under brutal attrition. Every mistake became data. Every disaster became refinement. By the time Arracourt arrived, the Americans no longer fought like amateurs copying European doctrine. They fought like an industrial organism luring in real time. And luring systems eventually become terrifying opponents, because they improve faster than isolated brilliance can compensate. That was the deeper reason Germany lost. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because German engineers lacked intelligence.
because Germany optimized harder and harder for a battlefield that was disappearing underneath them.
There is a moment in every collapsing system when reality becomes impossible to deny. Not for the soldiers. Soldiers usually understand long before governments do. Not for the engineers either. Engineers see limitations earlier than politicians ever will. The last people to recognize collapse are often the institutions built around yesterday's success. That was Germany in late 1944. Because even after Arracourt, many German leaders still believed victory could return through stronger weapons, bigger tanks, more advanced aircraft, new miracle technologies capable of reversing strategic momentum through sheer technical superiority. The obsession became almost spiritual. The King Tiger appeared with armor so thick many Allied shells struggled to penetrate it frontally. Massive guns capable of destroying enemy vehicles at terrifying distances. Heavy steel monsters designed to dominate direct combat absolutely. Then came the jet aircraft. The Me-262 flew faster than anything the Allies possessed. Revolutionary technology, decades ahead of its time. Pilots described Allied fighters looking almost stationary during attack runs. On paper, Germany continued producing nightmares. In reality, the war kept slipping away. Because the problem was never purely technological. The problem was systemic exhaustion. A King Tiger without fuel became a bunker. A jet aircraft without trained pilots became scrap metal. Advanced weapons without stable logistics, communication, reconnaissance, and operational flexibility became increasingly disconnected from battlefield reality. And nowhere was that contradiction clearer than the roads east of Arracourt. Destroyed Panthers littered muddy fields beside abandoned fuel trucks. Some vehicles remained mechanically functional, but could not continue maneuvering due to gasoline shortages. Others broke down during retreat because maintenance infrastructure had already collapsed under constant pressure. The Americans noticed something important during these final months of the war.
Germany still looked dangerous, but it no longer behaved sustainably. That distinction mattered enormously. A wounded predator can still kill, but if the wounds continue accumulating faster than recovery becomes possible, eventual collapse turns inevitable regardless of individual moments of violence. That was Germany after Arracourt. Still lethal, no longer stable. Meanwhile, the American war machine expanded almost frighteningly fast. Factories in Detroit continued producing Shermans by the thousands. Replacement parts crossed the Atlantic continuously. Training pipelines generated new crews at industrial scale. Air superiority tightened further every month. Communication systems improved. Coordination improved. Even American mistakes became survivable because the system itself remained resilient. That resilience terrified experienced German officers more than any individual tank ever could. Earlier in the war, German operational brilliance repeatedly shattered opponents psychologically through rapid, concentrated violence. Entire armies collapsed because they could not recover organizationally once momentum broke against them. But the Americans kept recovering. Lose vehicles? Recover. Lose territory? Reorganize. Encounter surprise? Adapt. The system bent constantly without fully breaking. And once Germany realized the Americans could absorb enormous punishment while continuing operational growth, the strategic future became brutally obvious.
Germany could still win battles. It could no longer win the war surrounding those battles. Arracourt helped prove that reality beyond argument. The Panthers fought well. The offensive still failed. That contradiction destroyed the final illusion that superior tactical machinery alone could reverse industrial imbalance. And beneath the military lesson existed something even colder. Human beings often mistake visible dominance for actual power. A Panther looked terrifying. A Sherman looked ordinary. But one represented concentrated excellence inside a weakening structure. The other represented acceptable capability inside a rapidly expanding system. History usually favors the second model over time, because systems accumulate advantage quietly while individuals attract attention loudly. You can see this pattern everywhere once you notice it. Companies collapse because they build brilliant products inside dysfunctional organizations. Athletes decline because raw talent outpaces recovery systems. Governments fail because symbolic strength hides institutional decay underneath. Even empires die this way. The surface still appears powerful while the internal machinery slowly loses the ability to adapt faster than external pressure evolves. At Arracourt, Germany still possessed some of the finest armored vehicles ever created. But America possessed the future structure of mechanized warfare. And structures outlive masterpieces. That is why the battle still matters today. Not because it proved one tank superior to another, because it revealed the exact moment industrial warfare crossed an invisible line. After Arracourt, modern battlefields would increasingly reward connectivity over isolation, adaptability over perfection, operational ecosystems over heroic platforms. The age of the lone armored predator was fading. A new age was arriving, one where information moved faster than steel. And in that world, the side learning fastest became the side most likely to survive.
The strange thing about revolutions in warfare is that most people do not recognize them while they are happening. They only become obvious afterward. When machine guns first appeared during the First World War, generals initially treated them like stronger rifles. They did not yet understand that entire battlefield doctrines had become obsolete overnight. When aircraft carriers emerged, many admirals still believed battleships remained the center of naval warfare. When radar arrived, some commanders dismissed it as merely a support technology instead of the foundation of a new operational age. Arracourt belonged to that same category of invisible transition. At first glance, it looked like another tank battle. In reality, it was something much larger. It was one of the first moments in modern warfare where battlefield networking decisively overwhelmed isolated battlefield superiority, and the implications stretched far beyond Lorraine. Because once information begins moving faster than individual weapons can react independently, the nature of power itself changes. That is exactly what happened to the Panther. The Panther was designed for a battlefield where individual armor dominance still determined outcomes. Superior armor, superior range, superior firepower. The logic made perfect sense based on Germany's earlier experiences. But Arracourt exposed a terrifying new reality. No matter how powerful the Panther became individually, it could still be surrounded operationally by faster communication and coordinated response systems. And once that happened, its strengths became increasingly difficult to translate into strategic success. The Americans exploited this relentlessly. One of the most important but least discussed aspects of Arracourt was battlefield initiative cycling. The concept was simple. Force the enemy to react repeatedly until he loses the ability to process events efficiently. Every time German armor advanced, artillery disrupted movement. Every time formations paused, aircraft threatened exposure. Every time Panthers engaged visible Shermans, Hellcats maneuvered toward vulnerable flanks. Every response triggered another problem somewhere else.
The German command structure became trapped inside an endless chain of reactions. That exhaustion mattered more than raw destruction alone. Because eventually, warfare becomes cognitive overload. Human beings cannot process uncertainty indefinitely under pressure without performance degrading. And by late September, many German formations around Arracourt operated under constant uncertainty. Where were the Hellcats positioned now? Which roads were already targeted by artillery? How quickly could aircraft arrive once visibility improved? Was the American withdrawal real, or another trap? Every unanswered question slowed decision-making. Every delay weakened defensive momentum further. Meanwhile, the Americans simplified their own battlefield thinking dramatically. Maintain communication, preserve coordination, keep the system functioning. That clarity reduced psychological stress enormously. The battlefield organism did not require perfect local victories. It only required continuous operational pressure. That distinction is critical. Germany often pursued decisive tactical dominance. America increasingly pursued sustainable operational control. And sustainable control eventually consumed decisive moments one after another. This pattern became visible everywhere during the final year of the war. Normandy, Mortain, Arracourt, the Ardennes.
Again and again, German armored excellence encountered Allied systems capable of absorbing shock faster than Germany could exploit breakthroughs. By then, the war had evolved into a contest between industrial nervous systems, and America possessed the larger, faster, more adaptive one. Even Soviet commanders noticed similar patterns on the Eastern Front. Large-scale coordination between artillery, armor, infantry, and logistics increasingly defined success more than individual vehicle quality alone. The battlefield was industrializing psychologically. That phrase sounds strange until you understand what modern war truly became during the 20th century. Not merely a clash of armies, a clash of organizational intelligence. Which nation processes information faster? Which command structure adapts faster? Which logistical network recovers faster? Which operational ecosystem survives disruption more effectively? These questions slowly replaced older ideas about battlefield heroics and isolated military excellence. Arracourt revealed that transformation with brutal clarity. And ironically, Germany helped create the very future that eventually destroyed it. Early Blitzkrieg doctrine already emphasized operational speed, communication, and combined arms integration. Germany pioneered many principles later refined by Allied forces.
Fast-moving mechanized warfare itself evolved partly from German innovation. But innovation creates danger. The side that invents a new system often becomes emotionally attached to its first successful version. That attachment can become fatal once the environment evolves further. Germany kept refining the predator. America kept refining the ecosystem surrounding the predator. Eventually, ecosystems win. Not because predators become weak, because isolated strength cannot survive forever against coordinated adaptation. That truth extends far beyond military history. It applies to economies, institutions, governments, even human relationships. The strongest individual often loses against the strongest network. And beneath the smoke of Arracourt, that reality became impossible to ignore.
There is one final irony hidden inside Arracourt that makes the battle feel almost philosophical. The Americans won partly because they stopped trying to be invincible. That sounds absurd at first. Most armies throughout history chase superiority through protection. Stronger armor, better fortifications, larger weapons. The instinct is ancient. Human beings naturally want safety through dominance. But by 1944, the United States Army increasingly accepted a colder reality. Perfect battlefield survival was impossible. So instead of optimizing for invulnerability, they optimized for recovery speed. That single shift changed everything. The Sherman tank embodied this philosophy perfectly. Compared to the Panther, it looked underwhelming. Thinner armor, smaller gun in many variants, less intimidating appearance. Even American crews often joked bitterly about its vulnerabilities. Yet the Sherman possessed qualities that mattered enormously inside a system-centered war. It was mechanically reliable, easy to mass produce, easy to repair, easy to transport across oceans, easy to integrate with logistics infrastructure already functioning at industrial scale. Most importantly, the Sherman could be replaced quickly. That point sounds cold, because it is cold. But industrial warfare rewards replacement capacity more consistently than battlefield perfection. A destroyed Sherman often returned as another Sherman within weeks. A destroyed Panther frequently disappeared forever. And eventually, those differences accumulate into destiny.
At Arracourt, American crews understood their tanks were vulnerable, yet many continued fighting aggressively because psychologically they no longer viewed survival through the same lens as German crews. The mission was not preserving the machine. The mission was preserving system momentum. That mindset reduced hesitation dramatically. A Hellcat crew did not need to dominate the battlefield permanently. It only needed to delay, disrupt, reposition, and survive long enough for artillery, aircraft, or other units to contribute. Everything became cooperative. Germany still fought largely through concentrated excellence. America increasingly fought through distributed resilience. And distributed resilience becomes extraordinarily difficult to destroy once scaled industrially. This explains why the battlefield around Arracourt felt so exhausting to German forces. Every tactical success seemed incomplete. Destroy several Shermans? More appear. Break through one defensive line? Another forms farther back. Force local retreat? Artillery still lands accurately. Damage communications? Nearby units adapt independently. The Americans transformed warfare into a problem of endurance rather than singular dominance. And endurance slowly strangled Germany's operational possibilities. Even the terrain around Arracourt amplified this transformation. Lorraine was not ideal tank country like the vast open spaces of the Eastern Front. Rolling hills, villages, forests, and narrow roads fragmented visibility constantly. Fog worsened the problem even further. The environment itself punished rigid concentration. German armored doctrine evolved partly around operational momentum across broader terrain where range and coordination advantages could fully mature.
At Arracourt, movement corridors narrowed, visibility collapsed, engagement distances shortened unexpectedly, ambushes became frequent. The battlefield became decentralized, and decentralized battlefields reward adaptable systems over hierarchical precision. The Americans sensed this instinctively. Small unit initiative became critical. Junior officers repositioned aggressively without waiting for elaborate centralized instructions. Tank destroyers shifted firing angles continuously. Artillery observers adapted in real time as German formations maneuvered through fragmented terrain. The battlefield organism stayed fluid. German operations increasingly struggled to. That fluidity became psychologically devastating because uncertainty compounds fatigue faster than physical danger alone. A soldier can endure enormous risk if the battlefield remains understandable, but confusion destroys confidence. And by the later stages of Arracourt, many German commanders no longer fully understood the operational environment around them. Reports arrived incomplete. Enemy positions shifted constantly. Air attacks threatened daylight movement. Fuel shortages restricted flexibility. Every decision carried hidden consequences. The battlefield became cognitively hostile. Meanwhile, the Americans simplified their operational philosophy into something brutally effective.
Stay connected, keep adapting, preserve tempo. That simplicity mattered enormously. Complex systems survive stress better when their core principles remain clear under pressure, and Arracourt proved the American system could absorb chaos without losing functional coherence. Germany could still produce extraordinary violence. America could still produce organized continuity. History usually rewards continuity. That is why so many modern military thinkers later viewed Arracourt as a preview of future warfare, rather than merely another World War II tank battle. Because future wars increasingly revolved around the same invisible contest, not who possesses the strongest isolated weapon, but who connects information, adaptation, logistics, communication, and firepower faster than the enemy can respond. In other words, who builds the better nervous system?
After Arracourt, the myth of the unstoppable heavy tank never fully recovered. The myth survived in popular culture, of course. Massive armored beasts still dominate documentaries, video games, and military discussions even today. Human beings are naturally fascinated by visible power. A gigantic machine carrying enormous guns feels like undeniable strength. But professional military thinkers began noticing something deeper after the war. Heavy battlefield dominance increasingly created hidden vulnerabilities. The Panther itself revealed this contradiction perfectly. To achieve superior armor and firepower, the vehicle became mechanically demanding. Complex transmissions, high fuel consumption, difficult maintenance requirements, enormous logistical strain. On ideal conditions, these trade-offs produced terrifying battlefield performance. In prolonged industrial warfare, they created fragility. This is one of the most important lessons hidden beneath the smoke of Lorraine. Strength often carries invisible costs, and systems eventually pay those costs whether they acknowledge them or not. The Americans approached warfare differently because their industrial philosophy differed fundamentally from Germany's. German engineering culture traditionally valued precision and technical excellence. Build the best machine possible, maximize battlefield capability, pursue superiority through craftsmanship and innovation. American industrial culture emphasized scalability. Can it be produced rapidly? Can it be repaired easily? Can average crews operate it effectively under harsh conditions? Can the supply chain sustain it across oceans? Can the system absorb losses without collapsing? Neither philosophy was inherently foolish, but by 1944, one adapted better to modern industrial war. The Americans built weapons designed to function inside massive operational ecosystems.
Germany increasingly built weapons demanding ecosystems it could no longer sustain. Arracourt exposed that imbalance mercilessly. The Panthers fought well. The system around them did not. Meanwhile, American crews often survived operationally even when individual battles turned ugly because the larger structure surrounding them remained intact. Fuel arrived, replacement vehicles arrived, artillery support remained available, aircraft coordination remained functional, communications continued adapting. The organism stayed alive. That distinction became more important than any single technical advantage. And quietly, almost invisibly, this marked the beginning of a much larger transformation in military history. The center of warfare was shifting away from platforms toward networks. Future conflicts would increasingly revolve around coordination speed rather than isolated firepower alone. Radar systems during the Cold War, integrated air defense networks, satellite reconnaissance, digital battlefield communication, precision-guided weapons linked through real-time targeting systems. The pattern repeated endlessly after Arracourt. Individual weapons still mattered, but isolated weapons mattered less and less compared to the systems connecting them.
In many ways, modern drone warfare reflects the same principle visible in Lorraine decades earlier. A single drone may not individually overpower a modern tank, yet networks of reconnaissance, targeting data, electronic warfare, artillery coordination, and communication systems can gradually neutralize vastly more expensive platforms through coordinated pressure. The logic is almost identical. The battlefield evolved from contests of isolated strength into contests of adaptive integration. And once that transformation begins, institutions unable to evolve psychologically become trapped inside outdated assumptions. That is exactly what happened to Germany. The terrifying part is how understandable the mistake was. German commanders trusted armored superiority because armored superiority had worked before. Blitzkrieg reshaped Europe through concentrated mechanized excellence. The lessons appeared obvious at the time. Success reinforced belief. Belief reinforced rigidity. Rigidity slowed adaptation. And slow adaptation became fatal once the battlefield itself evolved faster than doctrine. This cycle appears constantly throughout history. Empires collapse because old victories blind them to new realities. Corporations fail because successful models become intellectual prisons. Armies lose because they keep perfecting yesterday's answer while the question itself changes. At Arracourt, Germany perfected the art of tank warfare just as warfare itself began moving beyond the tank. That irony feels almost cruel.
especially because German soldiers often recognized the situation faster than political leadership did. Many experienced panzer officers understood increasingly well that Allied coordination, logistics, and air superiority were becoming overwhelming. But by then, systemic momentum already favored the Allies too heavily. The battlefield organism America created could absorb mistakes, losses, delays, and local setbacks while continuing to evolve. Germany increasingly could not. And once resilience diverges that dramatically between opponents, outcomes slowly become inevitable, regardless of individual moments of brilliance. That was the final lesson buried inside the fog at Arracourt. Not that stronger machines are meaningless, but that stronger machines alone cannot save systems that learn too slowly.
By early 1945, the war in Europe was no longer truly about victory. It was about timing. Everyone inside the German command structure could feel it. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose. The question was how long the system could continue functioning before complete collapse arrived. And strangely enough, that made the final months of the war even more dangerous. Because dying systems often become unpredictable. They stop optimizing for long-term survival and begin chasing emotional reversals, symbolic offensives, miracle weapons, desperate counterattacks designed less to solve reality than to deny it temporarily. The Ardennes offensive had already revealed this desperation. Massive armored concentrations thrown into impossible logistical conditions in hopes of recreating earlier blitzkrieg victories. It failed for the same reason Arracourt failed. The battlefield had evolved beyond the assumptions Germany still relied upon. But the deeper tragedy was this. Germany actually possessed some of the most intelligent military minds of the 20th century. Operational innovation, mechanized doctrine, combined arms maneuver warfare, mission-type tactics. Many concepts modern militaries still use today were refined by German thinkers during the war. Yet intelligence alone could not overcome institutional inertia. Because once an organization emotionally attaches itself to a successful model, adaptation becomes psychologically painful. And pain delays evolution. America adapted faster partly because it began from weakness. Kasserine Pass embarrassed the United States Army publicly. American commanders were forced to confront failure directly and without illusion. That humiliation became fuel for transformation. Germany experienced the opposite problem. Early victories reinforced confidence so powerfully that later adaptation slowed beneath the weight of previous success. This pattern exists everywhere in history. Weak systems learn because they must. Strong systems often stop learning because they believe they already understand reality. At Arracourt, those two trajectories collided. Germany arrived with extraordinary battlefield weapons attached to increasingly outdated operational assumptions. America arrived with imperfect battlefield weapons attached to rapidly evolving operational assumptions. The result became inevitable long before many people realized it. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the battle. Arracourt was not won through one genius decision, not through one invincible machine, not through one miraculous breakthrough. It was won through thousands of small adaptations layered together until the entire American battlefield organism became faster than German doctrine could process.
A radio transmission here. An artillery correction there. A Hellcat repositioning before detection. A junior officer making independent decisions without waiting for permission. A logistics convoy arriving on schedule. A fighter squadron redirected within minutes. Individually, none of these actions looked legendary. Together, they became overwhelming. That is how systems usually dominate history. Quietly at first, then all at once. And somewhere inside this transformation, the very image of military power began changing permanently. For centuries, military prestige centered around visible concentration. Massive fortresses, heavy cavalry, battleships, super heavy tanks. The logic always felt intuitive. The larger and stronger the object, the greater the power. But the 20th century slowly revealed something colder. Connectivity often matters more than concentration. A network can outmaneuver a fortress. Information can outpace armor. Adaptation can suffocate brute force. Arracourt became one of the clearest demonstrations of that transition ever recorded during the Second World War. The Panthers were magnificent.
But magnificence alone could no longer dominate a battlefield controlled by communication speed, layered coordination, decentralized initiative, and industrial continuity. That reality would shape the rest of modern warfare. Even today, militaries around the world still wrestle with the same question Arracourt exposed decades ago. Should resources prioritize stronger individual platforms or stronger operational networks? The answer increasingly favors networks, because modern battlefields punish isolation brutally. A single advanced weapon disconnected from reconnaissance, communication, logistics, and coordinated support becomes vulnerable no matter how powerful it appears individually, exactly like the Panther. And this is where the battle becomes strangely philosophical. Human beings love visible excellence because it feels emotionally satisfying. We admire the strongest warrior, the fastest athlete, the smartest individual, the most advanced machine. But history repeatedly rewards systems capable of learning, adapting, and coordinating faster than everyone else. Not perfection, adaptation. That was America's true advantage at Arracourt. Not superior tanks, superior evolution speed. And evolution speed eventually decides survival in every competitive environment, whether military, economic, political, or technological. The battlefield in Lorraine simply revealed the rule more brutally than most places ever do.
The war eventually ended the way collapsing systems usually end. Not with one final dramatic explosion, but through exhaustion. Factories stopped functioning, fuel disappeared, communication networks fractured. Cities fell one after another, while millions of exhausted soldiers continued fighting inside structures already dying around them. And by May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The Panther stopped moving. The radios went silent. The battlefield that once terrified Europe became ruins scattered across a continent buried in smoke and ash. But the ideas revealed during battles like Arracourt did not disappear. In many ways, they became more important after the war than during it. Because military thinkers around the world immediately understood something profound had changed. The future would belong to systems capable of integrating information faster than enemies could react. The United States embraced this lesson aggressively during the Cold War. Radar networks stretched across continents. Aircraft carriers became floating communication hubs rather than isolated naval weapons. Command and control systems evolved into massive, interconnected architectures capable of coordinating air, land, sea, and eventually space-based assets together. The battlefield became increasingly invisible. Not because weapons disappeared, because relationships between weapons became more important than the weapons themselves. And once that transformation began, history accelerated. Satellite reconnaissance, electronic warfare, precision-guided munitions, digital battlefield networks. Modern militaries now operate through layered systems so interconnected that individual platforms rarely fight alone anymore. Tanks coordinate with drones, aircraft link with satellites, infantry units receive live battlefield data from distant command centers. The logic behind all of it already existed in primitive form at Arracourt. A battlefield where coordination speed slowly became more decisive than raw mechanical dominance. That is why the battle still matters today. Not because of nostalgia, not because tanks are romantic, because Arracourt captured the exact moment modern warfare began shifting toward the age we still live in now. An age where information flow shapes survival.
And once you understand that, the battle starts feeling less like history and more like a warning. Because the same pattern repeats everywhere outside war too. Entire industries collapse because smaller, faster systems adapt quicker. Massive corporations fail because communication becomes rigid. Political institutions decay because bureaucracy slows response speed beneath changing realities. Even individuals experience this law quietly in their own lives. People who adapt survive longer than people who merely dominate temporarily. That is the hidden philosophy beneath Arracourt. The Panther represented concentrated excellence. America represented distributed adaptability. And adaptability won. Not cleanly, not instantly, but inevitably. This is why the battle feels strangely modern compared to many other famous clashes of the Second World War. Arracourt was not purely about courage or machinery anymore. It was about processing reality faster than the enemy. The Americans did not need invincible tanks. They needed faster reactions. They did not need perfect battlefield conditions. They needed flexible systems. They did not need every local engagement to succeed. They needed the overall organism to keep learning faster than German doctrine could stabilize. And once that process matured, the outcome slowly became irreversible.
Perhaps that is the cruelest truth about changing eras. The old world often continues fighting with enormous confidence long after the future has already arrived. At Arracourt, German crews still believed armored superiority could dominate the battlefield, because for years it had. And they were not foolish for believing it. History itself had rewarded that logic before. But history changed. Quietly. Gradually. Then all at once. The fog over Lorraine hid more than tanks and artillery that September.
It hid the death of an entire philosophy of warfare. The belief that superior machines alone could guarantee victory. When the fog finally lifted, the future stood revealed across the battlefield. Radios, air power, mobility, coordination, adaptation, systems moving faster than steel. And somewhere among the burned wrecks of Panthers scattered across the French countryside, the modern age of warfare fully arrived.
In the years after the war, visitors walked across the fields around Arracourt without realizing what had happened there. The villages rebuilt themselves slowly. Farmers returned to the land. Grass covered old shell craters. Rust consumed fragments of steel buried beneath the soil. Time erased the noise first, then the smoke, then the memory. That is how history usually disappears, quietly. But beneath those fields, one truth remained permanently buried inside the wreckage of September 1944. The world had changed. Not politically, operationally. Because Arracourt proved something humanity would spend the next century rediscovering again and again. No machine stays dominant forever once systems evolve around it. Not tanks, not aircraft, not ships, not economies, not empires. Every form of concentrated power eventually encounters a larger network capable of adapting faster than it can survive alone. That was the real story hidden beneath the Panthers and Hellcats. Germany created one of the most terrifying armored vehicles ever built. Even today, historians and engineers still admire the Panther for what it achieved technically. And they should. The machine was extraordinary. But the battlefield no longer belonged to extraordinary machines by themselves. It belonged to extraordinary coordination. The Americans understood this before most of the world did. Not perfectly, not philosophically, often through painful trial and error. But they learned faster. That was enough.
At Kasserine Pass, the United States Army looked inexperienced and fragmented. At Normandy, it learned survival. At Mortain, it learned operational layering. At Arracourt, it learned dominance through systems. And by the time the war ended, the United States had already begun building the operational blueprint for modern military power across the next 80 years. A blueprint centered not on invincibility, but on connectivity. The battlefield organism born in places like Lorraine would eventually evolve into carrier strike groups, satellite-guided warfare, digital communication networks, precision air campaigns, and modern integrated combat systems. The future started there, inside fog, inside mud, inside burning steel scattered across French farmland. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this. The German crews fighting at Arracourt were not weak men trapped inside bad machines. Far from it. Many were experienced veterans operating some of the finest armored vehicles ever constructed during the Second World War. They fought with discipline, courage, and professionalism under impossible conditions. Yet they still lost, because history had shifted underneath them faster than they could adapt. That possibility terrifies every powerful institution in every era. The idea that strength itself can become outdated, that superiority can slowly transform into rigidity, that yesterday's masterpiece can become tomorrow's liability.
Arracourt was not simply a tank battle. It was the funeral of an old idea, the belief that raw battlefield superiority alone could guarantee victory. After Lorraine, warfare increasingly became something colder and more complex, a contest of networks, communication speed, operational flexibility, industrial continuity, decision-making cycles, adaptation under pressure. The strongest weapon still mattered, but the strongest system mattered more. And that principle now shapes nearly every competitive structure on Earth. Nations, corporations, technologies, even human lives. Because survival rarely belongs to the strongest forever. It belongs to the side that learns fastest when reality changes. That is why Arracourt still matters. Not because of the tanks, because of the warning hidden beneath them. The world changes quietly at first, then suddenly. And the people who survive are usually the ones who recognize the new battlefield before everyone else does.